Okay, so this is where we stopped last time. So we are now, yes.
Is there a chance we get the screen down?
Oh. I haven't done this for a while. I forgot which one is. Yeah. Okay, good. So this is where we stopped last time. We were talking about the supply side of the market. So what is the supply side of this market? The supply side of this market is the producers, the firms. We have intentionally kept the role of suppliers in this market quite simple. We think that our suppliers are our firms who are these mindless organizations. The only thing that they care about is profit. This is a very simplistic view of the firm behavior, but we are going to keep it that way. Our suppliers are selling stuff in this market. Our suppliers are also the producers of the goods in this market, and the distinction is extremely important. In actual reality, a supplier does not necessarily be the producer. A supplier could be a retailer who buys from the wholesalers and sells in the market. In our simple model, we are assuming that our supplier or our seller is also the producer. This idea is going to become extremely important because what or how much the seller wants to sell in the market really affects how much he produces. The law of supply really summarizes the relationship between how the seller responds to price and how much he produces. The law of supply says that whenever price of the product in question goes up, our seller produces more and supplies more. Produces more and supply more. Which means that the relationship between price and quantity supplied is a positive one, which is indicated by an upward sloping supply curve. Just like the demand side, we can look at change in supply as follows. Anytime our supply curve shifts to the right, we are going to call it an increase in supply, like that. And anytime our supply curve shifts to the left, like this, we are going to call it a decrease in supply. Okay? So there is nothing magical about that, but before we move on to really play with the supply curve, we need to, again, just like the demand side, understand the distinction between quantity supplied and supply. The distinction between change in quantity supplied and change in supply is equally important when we talk, similar to the discussion that we had when we talked about change in quantity demanded and change in demand. Imagine that at a given price P1, the original quantity supplied was Q1, and for some reason, the supply curve shifts to the right. As a result, the quantity that firms were willing to supply increases from Q1 to Q3. When at the same price P1, the producers are willing to supply more, we call it a change in supply. So a change in supply is a short explanation that the supply curve has shifted. If on the other hand, there is just an increase in price from P1 to P2 or a decrease, doesn't really matter. You just move from point A to point B and increase your quantity supplied from Q2 to, let's say, Q4. And a change like this from A to B, where you are moving along the same supply curve, is called a change in quantity supplied. So whenever we hear the word change in quantity supplied, we actually know that our supply curve is not shifting. We are staying on the same supply curve. We are just moving from one point of the supply curve to another point of the supply curve. So notice that these two changes from the quantitative side are identical. When quantity supplied is changing from Q1 to Q3, we are calling it change in supply. When the quantity supplied is changing from Q2 to Q4, we are calling it change in quantity supplied. The distinction lies on the fact that in one case, the supply curve shifted, in the other one, it did not. Are we all clear on that? Please take a moment to review the idea. Okay. What we're now going to do is, just like we did for the demand side, we're going to look at the factors that cause this supply curve to change, to shift, to be more specific. We're going to look at a list of factors. The most important of them is the first one, price of inputs. So in order to understand this, let us go back and try to understand what is a firm or what is a seller. In this case, our seller is the producer of the good, which means that he buys a lot of inputs, raw materials, put them in the production process, produces something, and then sells into the market. As we have argued that our producers are this mindless institution that wants to maximize their profit, and that's all they care about. So when the price of an input changes, it changes the cost of production for a producer. The example that we're looking at is an example of a smartphone, and we are looking at the several inputs that are used in the production process, like labor, computer processor. Now we are imagining that there is an increase in the price of the input. So when the price of an input increases, what does it mean for our producer? Anyone? How do our producer look at an increase in input price? Not the output one. This is the price of raw materials that he is buying. Anyone?
Produce less.
Well, the first thing that we need to figure out is that whenever the price of input increases, it increases the cost of production for our producer. Make sense? If it increases the cost of production for our producer because all the inputs are more expensive now, and increasing the cost of production decreases the profit margin for our producer. And that's exactly how we should think about a firm. A firm looks at everything from the lens of profit. When price of input increases, it increases his cost of production, meaning that his profit margin is going to go down, and then he's going to supply less. Makes sense? Any question? So when the profit goes down, that causes our supplier to supply less. Graphically, this is represented by a leftward shift of the supply curve. The next one is by far the most discussed factor that affect supply curve. Why it is the most discussed one? Because we are going to talk about this idea of technological change at least in 3 chapters. When you take more advanced economics course such as Principles of Macroeconomics, we will emphasize the role and the importance of technological change in economics. For this rudimentary course, what I'm going to do, I'm going to add another term to defining technological change. The reason why I'm doing that is because the video that I will upload will not talk about technological change, but it will talk about something called productivity, and they are the same thing. So what is productivity? A productivity is defined as Y divided by L, where Y is amount of output you produce and L is the amount of labor inputs you use. So Y divided by L gives you an idea about how much output you are producing with your inputs. And you can imagine that as a firm, you want this number to be as high as possible, meaning that you want to be able to produce a lot of output with a little amount of input. So the question is, how can you do that? How can you produce a lot with a little bit of inputs? The answer is, there are several ways you can do that. And we are going to have a very lengthy discussion about the various kinds of productivity or technological change that can allow you to do that. So the first candidate of raising the productivity of your firm is technological change. Now, the idea of technological change in economics is kind of broad, right? When we think about technological change, the first things that comes to our mind are technological inventions, like the invention of electricity, the invention of internet. These are things that we know have clearly made our inputs more productive. With the use of internet, a worker can now find a job more efficiently than they were doing 20 years ago. So these technological inventions, like a steam engine that allows you to produce a lot of goods without putting a lot of labor, are examples of technological change that has a direct effect on the cost of production of our farm. Everything about a farm is related to cost. Now, better technology, no matter how expensive they are at the beginning, over the time reduces the cost of production of our farm. So technological change is good for our farm. Now, the idea of technological change is not only confined to this idea of technological inventions like internet or whatever. There are other innovations that are equally important in reducing the cost of production for a farm. And we usually talk about them in a broader technological change context. A prime example, assembly line. What is an assembly line? Anyone? Is everyone familiar with the word assembly line? So what is that?
The process of producing a product where each step is a different portion of the product being made.
So around the beginning of this 19th century, so Ford came up with this idea. It's an organizational idea. There was no technological innovation associated with that. He did not use a more sophisticated technology. He just changed the way his factors are being organized. Rather than have a bunch of people work on one car, he created this assembly line idea where one individual focuses on only one task of a car. This assembly line, or this innovative way of organizing the production, cut the cost of making a car by about 85%. And the rest is history. We all know what happened, right? So, any factor, any change, either it's a technological invention or a technological innovation or some kind of management innovation, whatever, that improves the productivity of a farm, affects their supply. It affects their supply by reducing the cost of production. So anytime you have a technological change or a productivity gain, you are going to have a that will lower the cost of production for our firm, and whenever the cost of production of a firm goes down, supply curve shifts to the right. Any example? Any question? I will skip the discussion about government intervention in promoting technological change because government role is critical. After our exam 1, next week we are going to bring a chapter where we are going to exclusively discuss the role of government. So more on that later. The next one are very, very interesting. Okay? There are two concepts at the same slide. So let's focus on the first one. We are now going to think about the role of substitutes in the production, in the supply decisions. Okay, so we had a very healthy discussion about how substitutes affects the demand side. Remember, for a buyer, there are goods that a buyer buys in conjunction with each other. Sometimes a buyer buys goods together, and they're called complementary goods, like coffee and sugar. And sometimes our consumer buys one good as a substitute for the other good, like Coke and Pepsi, and they are called substitutes. We have similar kind of concepts on the production side of the economy. On the production side, there are two goods that can be substitute in production, meaning that a producer can produce either of them. The most common example of substitutes in production probably resides in agriculture. So the example that you're looking at is an example of a soybean and a corn production. Those of you who have experience with or a little bit knowledge about the production, they require a similar kind of fertilizers, weather conditions. So if a farmer has a piece of land, a farmer can either use the entire land to produce soybean or corn or produce some combination of them. So for a farmer, soybean and corn are substitute in production. So in case of a substitute in production, we are looking at the price of soybean to go up. So if the price of soybean increases, notice that our producer can make more profit by producing and selling more soybeans. Law of supply, right? Nothing fancy. Are we all clear on that? So if the price of soybean increases, the quantity supplied of soybean increases according to law of supply, which means that our producer is allocating more resources towards the production of soybean, and that has a direct effect on the corn production. Meaning that when the soybean production goes up, the corn production goes down. Right? So, when we have an increase in price of soybean, the effect of an increase in price of soybean in the production of corn is that it is going to reduce the supply and the production of corn because they are substitute in production. Any question? Goods can also be complementary in production. How can two goods be complementary in production? Any thought on this? Any example that you can think of that are complementary in yes? Sugar and flour.
Yeah, like whenever you're making something.
Well, there are a lot of things that are produced. I mean, when you buy a chocolate candy, you will see that it says that it is being produced or processed at a place that produces and processes a lot of peanuts, right? So chocolate peanuts probably are complementary in production. Hershey makes all these different kind of products in the same production unit, right? They are all complementary in production. The way to think about complementary in production are production that uses the same set of inputs. That's how soybean and corn were substituted, because they were using identical inputs, right? So you can either produce soybean or you can produce corn. So peanut and chocolate for Hershey is an example of substitute in production. Are we all clear on that? Now let's come back to an example where goods are produced together. It's difficult to find examples like that because we rarely think about them this seriously. A lot of byproducts are produced automatically when you produce something, right? So byproducts could be an example of complementary productions. So please remember this idea, because at the very later part of this course, we are going to come back to this complementarity in production in the context of pollution and externality. The next one is the number of firms. So the number of firms and how it affects supply is rudimentary, very simple. Just like the number of buyers increased market demand and shifted the demand curve to the right, the increase in the number of firms increases the market supply and shifts the supply curve to the right. Right? The one that I think is critical is this one. So we are now discussing about how expected future price changes affects our firm's decisions. On the buyer side, we already noticed that this is a very critical issue. And we saw that whenever there is an expected increase in future price, our buyer actually buys more today if the good is non-perishable. If the good is perishable, our buyer saves part of their money for tomorrow, so their consumption or demand goes down today. So depending on what kind of goods we are talking about, unexpected future price changes affects our buyer's behavior in a fundamentally different way. Do we see similar kind of behavior on the producer side? The answer is yes. As it turns out that how the producers or firms or sellers respond to future prices are much more standard in economics. And we're going to start this discussion by talking about this word called inventory. So what is an inventory?
How much you hold in stock. It's not actually being sold at the moment, but they help you sell.
That's a very, very good answer. So let us summarize that answer by using much simpler words. Inventory is part of your production which you don't sell. Part of your production which you don't sell. What does it mean? It means that inventory are goods that you have already produced, but you're not selling them in the market. Inventory is kind of critical. Why? Because if we believe that our producers are also the sellers, our seller is making a decision to produce something and not selling them. Why? Before we answer the question why, let us convince ourselves that inventory is probably the most common behavior of a firm. You can go to Pizza Hut right now, and back in the back side, they will have a huge refrigerator where there are a lot of uncooked or semi-cooked pizzas, and that's an inventory, right? Now, Pizza Hut's inventory is very different from the inventory that GM keeps for their car. Any question? There is a very interesting discussion in the slide and in the book about a movie. I always like movie examples. I'm running out of time today, so I'm going to skip that. Before we move on to the final part of this chapter, which is probably the most critical one, let us remind ourselves one more time about the most important distinction things that we learned in chapters, in the supply side, which is a distinction between the movement and the shift of a supply curve. And this will play a very important role for your success in the exam. When we move from A to B by being on the same supply curve, when price increases from 200 to 250 and we just move along the same supply curve, from A to B, this is called a change in quantity supplied. So a change in quantity supplied or a movement, they are always associated with the same supply curve. When we move to a different supply curve, like from B to C, this is called a change in supply or a shift in supply. So change in supply, shift in supply, equivalent. Movement along the supply curve, change in quantity demanded, equivalent. Okay, please remember that. There are some questions that I think are very critical, so please take a look at these answers. And if you have trouble, identifying the correct answers, please get in touch with me. I want to look at only one of these, in-class problems set today, and that's this one. Anyone? Okay, so we are talking about an impact of an increase in expected future price, right? So that's like what we just did. So you are expecting in the future the price of your concert tickets will go up. That will be represented by a leftward shift of the supply curve, which means that if future price increase, you supply less today. So the answer is A. Make sense? There are also some other interesting questions. I'm going to skip that and I'm going to directly move to the market equilibrium concepts. I have a frustrating 10 minutes. This is... Anyway, we need to cover this, otherwise, because it's in your exam. So what is market equilibrium? I always want to start the discussion about market equilibrium by looking at a table, and I don't actually have a table here, but this is what we think a table is, right? I want to start by pointing out that when you think about a market, and that's what we are trying to understand in this chapter, a market is a place where people bargain. The buyers and the sellers bargain. They negotiate on a price. They negotiate on a quantity. Without the existence of bargain, market would not exist. Are we all clear on that? I know that a lot of people really don't like bargaining. They would like to go to a market that has fixed price. They pay for the price and then they leave. What they don't realize that even the price that they are paying, which is fixed, was fixed through a bargaining process. So who is bargaining? The answer is both of them are bargaining. Imagine a table where there is a buyer and there is a seller on two sides and they are talking with each other. And by talking, they are actually bargaining and they are trying to get the best possible price and the best possible quantity. What we realize is that in this bargaining process, these two sides have fundamentally different objectives. Right? Our buyer wants to pay the lowest possible price and our seller wants to charge the highest possible price. If their objectives were not fundamentally different, this bargaining would not have been that interesting. But it is very, very interesting. Because one tries to raise the price and the other wants to keep the price as low as possible. Do we all see that? So our discussion about market has to come through a thorough understanding about this bargaining process. When we talk about bargain, not everyone has the same bargaining power. Right? So the question that we're going to start today with, this part, is that does everyone, meaning the demand side or the supply side, have the same kind of bargaining power in a market? By bargaining power, we want to understand who has a stronger say in how the market will play out. The answer is it depends. And what it depends on is going to be the subject matter of the next discussion of the next couple of minutes. So what we're going to do, this is a market equilibrium. A market equilibrium is an equilibrium quantity that the buyer is willing to buy and a seller is willing to sell. Market equilibrium is a price that the buyer is willing to pay and the seller is willing to accept. So market equilibrium is actually a combination of price and quantity that both the buyer and the seller agree upon. Graphically, market equilibrium is found at the intersection between demand and supply. The reason why this is equilibrium, because notice that this intersection point is on both the demand and the supply curve. So from the demand side, if the buyer wants to buy 10 units, he is willing to pay $200. From the supply side, if the seller wants to sell 10 units, he is willing to accept $200. So therefore, $200 is the price that buyer is willing to pay, seller is willing to accept, and at that price, the buyer is willing to buy 10 units and the seller is willing to sell 10 units of output. And that makes it a market equilibrium. To understand the importance of market equilibrium, we will now look at situations where the market is not in equilibrium. The first situation that we are going to look at is a situation where the market price, let's say, is about 250. At 250, the amount that buyer wants to buy is 9. How do we know that? We start with the price, we go to the demand curve, we move down vertically to the horizontal axis. The 9 is how much the buyer wants to buy. At 250, the amount that seller wants to sell is 11. How do we know that? We start with the price, we go to the supply curve, go down vertically to the horizontal axis, and that's the quantity that seller wants to sell. You should see that when the price is 250, the amount that seller wants to sell is 11 and the amount that buyer wants to buy is 10. That means the amount that seller wants to sell is higher than the amount that buyer wants to buy. We call it a surplus. So the question is, when you have surplus in the market, who has the higher bargaining power? Anyone? Somebody says supplier. So there are a lot of sellers willing to sell to a small number of buyers. That's what the surplus means, right? Who has a higher bargaining power? The buyer has a higher bargaining power. The buyer is going to tell our seller is that, look, the price that you are charging me is too much. I do not like this price. The only way I will be able to buy more from you is if you lower my price. If The if the seller is forced to lower the price, our seller is going to sell less, but then our buyer is going to buy more by paying a lower price, and until they meet at the intersection point where the market is in equilibrium. So when there is a surplus, our buyer forces the seller to lower the price, puts a downward pressure on the market, and finally we move to the equilibrium where everything stops. Where everything stops. Buyer no longer wants to lower price, seller no longer wants to sell less. Equilibrium is where both the buyer and the seller have equal bargaining power. Makes sense? The next one is a situation where the price is less than the market price that we're looking at. So imagine the market price is 100. At 100, the amount that buyer wants to buy is 12. At that 100, the amount that seller wants to sell is 8. You notice clearly that the amount that buyer wants to buy is greater than the amount that seller wants to sell. When you have a situation where buyer wants to buy more than what the seller wants to sell, we call it shortage. When we have shortage, who has a higher bargaining power? Seller now has a higher bargaining power, because seller will tell the buyer that, look, the price that you are you want to pay is too low. You have to pay me a higher price so that I will be willing to sell you more. So by paying a higher price, our buyer buys less and our seller sells more until they find the equilibrium where all the bargaining stops. Okay? When there was a shortage, it puts an upward pressure on the market price, so we finally reach to an equilibrium. In order to really appreciate the market equilibrium, we are going to bring both the supply, surplus and demand together, excess demand, shortage together. And we are going to say that whenever the market is in a shortage or a surplus, it always comes back to the equilibrium. When the market is in surplus, it puts a downward pressure on the market. When the market is in shortage, it puts an upward pressure on the market. Finally, we find equilibrium where all this locomotion stops. So a market equilibrium is a situation where everything is stable. The next task is to figure out what happens when demand side or the supply side changes and how it affects the market equilibrium. Because market equilibrium is not constant. Anytime your demand curve shifts or your supply curve shifts or both of them shifts, your market equilibrium will change. We're going to look at, due to the time that I have, which is like 2 minutes, I'm going to just look at one. I'm going to look at, so I actually have to look at least 3. So think about, consider a situation where there is a change in demand side. So this is original demand, original supply, market equilibrium is P star and Q star, and suddenly my demand increases. An increase in demand means demand curve shifts up from D to D1. You can see clearly that we have new equilibrium at the intersection between the old supply and the new demand curve. So if A was my original demand equilibrium, B is my new equilibrium. At new equilibrium, price goes up and quantity goes up. Do we all see that? At the same time, if you have now a situation where the supply shifts from S to S1, you should see that equilibrium price goes down from P star to P1, and equilibrium quantity increases from Q star to Q1. So that's Q star and that Q1. The one that I'm going to cover, and please stay with me for a couple of minutes, this is kind of important, is a situation where both of these curves shift at the same time. I will be able to cover one, your SI leaders will cover the rest, and the video that I will upload will cover everything. Okay? The one that we are interested in is a situation where both demand and supply increase at the same time. So the first one that we're going to look at, we're going to call that case, case 1. So demand increase, supply increase, we are going to call that case 1. Case 1 is a situation, please take a look at that. We're going to again start with our original market equilibrium, P star and Q star. and we are assuming both demand and supply increases. In the first case, we are going to assume that the increase in demand is larger than increase in supply. Okay? A is our original market equilibrium, B is our new market equilibrium. Where is B? B is at the intersection between our new demand and our new supply. So shift in a demand is, in this case, is greater than shift in supply. Do we all see that? So the new equilibrium price is P1 and the new equilibrium quantity is Q1. So in this case you can see that equilibrium price have gone up, equilibrium quantity have gone up as well. Right? Please stay with me 1 minute. I just want to draw the next one. You should be able to go like within 1 minute. The next one is gonna be opposite to that. It's gonna be shift in demand is smaller than shift in supply. So we start with D and S, P star, Q star. The shift in demand is smaller, like from D to D1, and the shift in supply is very large, from S to S star. The original equilibrium was at A, the new equilibrium is at point B, price is P1, Q, quantity is Q1. So in this case, price goes down and quantity increases. Do we all see that? So if you are asked, what happens to price and quantity when both demand and supply increases, what would you say? Sorry? You are going to say that the effect of price is ambiguous, right? It can either go up or go down depending on what you have, but quantity always increases. Quantity always increases. In both cases, quantity have gone up.